The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them.
This is the bed we're about to build. Now it's going to be a great lesson in how to get stock to the thickness that we need. Now more often than not, you'll get to the lumber yard and you can't get 16/4 stock to make the legs out of, or perhaps even 3/8 stock that we need for the slats. So in this project, we're going to focus a lot on how to get stock into the thicknesses that we need to work with. Now we're going to start out by getting our slats milled up to their proper thickness and shape. To make the slats, I'm starting out with 1-inch thick cherry. Now of course we want them to be 3/8 of an inch, so I'm resawing them down their length. And that'll give me roughly about a 7/16 inch length. Then we'll plane them smooth over at the planer. Now to resaw the material, I like to use the bandsaw. It's the most efficient tool for resawing material. Now it starts out with a very simple layout line, and that goes right down the length of the board, right along the center line. Over here at the bandsaw, I've installed my resawing fence, and that's a very simple device. It's just rounded on this edge, and it's as tall as my piece is wide that I want to resaw. Now the critical component is that this edge has to be parallel to the blade, and in our case we want the center of the blade to be cut right at 1/2 of an inch. So I've got that adjustment set, and now with our board laid out, the way this will work is I want to keep my board tight against the resaw fence so that it's not tilted this way at all, and just steer the cut along so I stay right along my cut line. Well, the bandsaw does a nice job of resawing the material. We're left with a relatively rough surface. So a quick pass through on my surface planer and I'll have some nice looking 3/8 inch thick stock. I was going to go ahead and start sanding each of my slats at this point because it's very easy to sand such a large flat area. However, that planer did such a nice job, I'm going right to the ripping operation. Now I'll go ahead and rip all of my 2 1/8 inch wide slats, but I'll leave the wider slats, the 2 center ones, a little bit oversized because we'll adjust those during assembly. The legs for this bed are 3.5 inches square. Now you could go out and buy 4-inch square stock, which they would call 16/4 stock, and then mill it down. However, finding 16/4 stock for cherry can be a bit of a challenge. So we're going to take a look at how you can build a box shape and cap it off with a nice attractive cap and foot to close off the ends. This is how we're going to be making the legs. We'll be using 3/4 inch thick stock, and we're going to, so to speak, rip it to a little bit more than 3.5 inches wide. But we're going to rip it with a bevel cut, a 45-degree angle. And that will allow us to take 4 pieces and construct a box that will serve as the leg. Now there are a couple of steps that are very important in this process. We have to make sure that we've got exactly a 45-degree angle for our bevel cuts. Now to do that, I use a drafting triangle, and then I tilt my saw blade over and line it up perfectly with that drafting triangle. It tends to be a little bit more accurate than the scale that's on our tilt mechanism. Now I'm going to use a feather board to help hold the board down against the table, and you'll notice that I've moved my fence to the other side of the blade. And that just makes the ripping operation a little bit easier when making these bevel cuts. Our next step is to cut some biscuit slots. And the biscuits will help us with alignment as we clamp this box together. Now I've gone through and laid out each of the 4 pieces that make up the leg with the inside surface up. I then drew lines representing where the top and bottom edges of the leg will be. Now I've cut mine off about 3 inches too long at this point, and that'll give me plenty of trimming room when we get them all assembled and we can cut them off to the proper length. Then I laid out my biscuit locations, and I've set up for 5 biscuits. When joining 2 pieces together on a bevel with 3/4 inch thick stock, you don't really want to use number 20 biscuits. You should drop down to a number 10 or a number 0. The number 20 biscuit is a little bit too wide, and you may run the risk of cutting your biscuit slot out through onto the face of the board. So I'll be using number 10 biscuits. We're getting ready now to assemble up one of our legs. All 4 legs assemble in the same procedure. Now on one of the boards that will make up one side of the leg, we're going to be machining some mortises in there. And because we're only 3/4 inch thick, that doesn't give the tenon a lot of surface to grip onto. So we're going to add a filler strip. And all I've done was taken some cherry, and in this case it was actually mostly sapwood, so it's not real appealing anyhow. And I've ripped it down so that it's about 1 15/16 inch wide. And I want to place that on the inside surface of one face of the leg. Now when I position my filler strip, I want to make sure that it doesn't extend over into anywhere where that bevel is, because we don't want this filler strip to prevent us from bringing together the 4 pieces or to create any interference there. So I'll carefully position that and tack it in place with a couple of brads. Now I have gone through and dry fit this entire assembly to make sure everything fits up nice. Now I'll go ahead and apply glue in each of my biscuit slots and along each of the beveled faces. First we'll bring a couple of clamps straight down against the workbench, just snugging those up a little bit. Then we'll put a caul on each of the 2 faces, sneaking this one behind. And then we'll bring clamps in this direction. And we can draw everything together good and tight. A couple more clamps on here, we're all set. We'll let it cure for about an hour and move on to the other 3 legs. And now we can cut off the legs to their proper overall length. The next step for our legs is to machine the mortises that will receive the loose tenons, and that's how we're going to join the rails to the legs. Now we're going to be using this mortising jig, which is designed to work with your handheld router. Now in the last issue we showed you how to cut your mortises using a hollow chisel mortiser. This issue we're focusing on cutting mortises with your router. Now we do show you in great detail all the steps necessary to build and use this jig. So for now we'll just say that we're going to be routing our mortises using this jig. If you want more information, be sure to check out our time saver story. with a 1/4 inch radius roundover bit in my handheld router, I can go ahead now and round over the edges of each of the 4 legs. The leg caps and feet need to have the top edge rounded over. To do that, I've installed a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my router, and you can either use a router pad or you can clamp your workpiece in the bench vise like I did and round over the edges. The next step for the legs is to attach the caps at one end and the feet at the other. To do that, I'll be using 2 biscuits for each of the 2 caps or feet. To fasten on the caps, we'll apply a little bit of glue on each of the biscuit slots. Install the biscuits and clamp everything together. For the side rails and the lowest rail on the headboard, we're going to be laminating together some stock to construct those. Take a look, it's real easy. To get started on the bed side rails, I'm going to be laminating together 3 pieces of 1 inch thick cherry. Now that 3 inch thickness will end up resawing down the middle to get our 2 rails. But again, this is just another technique of building up thinner boards to make the overall thickness that you actually need. Now I'll be laminating these together using standard yellow woodworking glue. I'm using the extended glue because, well, clamping up something like this can take a little while. So I'm just buying myself a little extra time. And now we just clamp everything together. And of course, this is going to require a lot of clamps. I'm going to start out using a couple of 2x4s to act as clamping cauls. And these will help to distribute the clamping pressure across our glue up. You can't over-tighten this glue up. And we just keep adding more and more clamps and cauls. And that should about do it. We'll let this dry for about 1.5 hours, 2 hours. Then we can scrape off the excess glue, joint it, rip it, and resaw it to its proper thickness. Now that the glue is dried on the rails, I can go ahead and joint one edge so that it's square to one of the faces. Now with the one edge jointed square to the face, I can go ahead and rip this to its overall width of 6 inches. However, I do have a large 3 horsepower table saw here, so I can take a 3-inch thick cut. I still have to work pretty gingerly, but I can do it. Now if you're using a smaller table saw, we could of course resaw it in half first and then rip it to width. Resawing the rails is pretty much the same setup as it was for resawing the slats. Parts just a little bit bigger, but realistically our cut width is about the same as I was doing for the slats. And of course I'm using the drill press over there as an outfeed support. It is a rather heavy timber. And now we can round over the edges of our rails so that there aren't any sharp corners. To round over the edges, I'm using a 1/4 inch radius roundover bit in my handheld router. And now we can go ahead and start cutting off all the rails to their proper length. These angle brackets are what we're going to use to support the mattress. Now we're going to go ahead and mortise these in to the sides of the rails so that it looks a little bit more clean. Now to do that, I've built a very simple jig out of 1/4-inch birch plywood and a scrap piece of wood, and just machined my slot large enough to duplicate the shape using a 1/2-inch guide bushing with a 3/8-inch router bit. And the positioning and setup of it is very straightforward, and of course we'll show you that step. For the side rails, we're putting in 3 of these angle brackets. For the head and footboard rails, there'll just be 1 in the center. To do the layout, all I'm doing is just placing a mark at each of the locations. Then I clamp my jig in place, roughly centered over that mark. If we're off by a little bit, it really won't matter. With the jig clamped in place and my board clamped down to the workbench, I can go ahead and route out that slot. Now we can turn our attention to the curved crest rails as well as the lower rails that fill out the field area for our slats. Now the construction technique we're going to use on these is a lamination. It's very difficult to machine these mortises, so a lamination makes the job real easy. As mentioned earlier, each of the rails are going to be made up of a sandwich, a 3/4-inch thick board, a 3/8 thick board, and then another 3/4-inch thick board. Now the 3/8-inch thick material I planed just a little bit thicker than the slat material, and that'll allow them to float in there a little bit. Now what we have to do is lay out the curves for the top rail for both the head and footboard. And as you can see here, I've taken a thin strip of wood. It's 3/4-inch wide by a 1/2-inch thick, and I put it between a long bar clamp. And with that, I can adjust tension on this board, and that will create a curve on it. Now I've laid out the locations for my 3 control points, and that would be at the center of the curve, and then where that curve comes down and meets up with the ends of the boards. I've placed those layout marks on there, adjusted the tension to get the curvature just right, and then draw my line on there. Now all of my material for these rails I've cut off so that I've got an extra 2 inches on each end. And that will allow us to have a little room for if we need to screw or nail the pieces together during some of these machining operations. Now I'll use this curved rail as a template to cut out the other pieces. So I'll just be laying out the one and then use the one to create the others. You could cut out these curves with a handheld jigsaw. However, the bandsaw is much more efficient. Now I will make sure that I stay away from that line so that I've got some material left on there where I can clean it up with a belt sander. I've got all the rail pieces now cut to their appropriate shape for assembly. Now the assembly is going to be in a couple of steps. The first thing we're going to do is take that 3/8-inch thick piece and glue it to one of the 3/4-inch pieces. Now on the headboard piece, the curve goes up. So we want our curved 3/8-inch piece to be flush along the top edge. For the footboard piece, the curve points up, or the concave portion is coming up. So we want to laminate our 3/8-inch piece so that it is flush along the concave surface. And we'll just do that by using some yellow woodworking glue, and we'll use a couple of brads at each end to prevent the pieces from sliding around while that glue sets up. So I'll bring these into alignment, and again, as I mentioned before, I cut my pieces or my blanks about 2 inches extra long on each end, and that's where I'll place a brad to help hold these things in position while we clamp everything together. That's one clamped up. We'll do the same to the other, and then we have to laminate in the piece, the 3/8-inch thick piece, on the 2 lower rails as well. As you can see here, I'm getting ready for my next step of assembly. I'm very carefully taking the upper rail and lower rail and aligned each other so that they're square to each other and that they're parallel to each other. And to help with that, I've cut a couple of strips of wood to act as spacers to hold the two rails at their proper separation. Our next step is to install these spacer blocks between each of the slats. Now the slats, of course, are all the same width, and so should the spacer blocks. And if you look at the spacer block, I've just ripped a piece of 3/8 thick material to a width that's large enough to cover the gap. Then I've cut them off all to the same length, which is equal to the width of each of the slats. Now the way this will work, we're going to start out along the lower rail and get that part assembled first. And we'll start at the very end and work our way towards the center. And we'll just take it one spacer block and one slat at a time until we meet up in the center. The first spacer that we put in is very critical in regards to where we place it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I cut off my rails so that they're 2 inches on each end longer, or 4 inches overall length too long. So I have to account for that when I'm setting in my spacer blocks. So I do want to get the first one in, and we'll apply a little bit of glue. Don't get carried away with it. You don't want to deal with the squeeze out. And I'll set that in place. Now I'm going to very carefully measure in from the end my 2 inches. Now I'm going to tack that in place with one brad. And I do want to make sure that I put that brad all the way towards the center of the rail, or in towards this way. Because later on we're going to be routing out an area, or milling out an area here, which will be actually the mortise for our mortise and tenon joint. So I don't want to hit that brad with a router bit later on. And that locks in our first spacer block. Now I'll take my slat, slide that up tight against the spacer block, bring in the next spacer block, and I'll glue and tack that one in place, and then work my way towards the center. Our next step is to cut off each of the slats to their length. Now I do want to leave a little gap in there, and we're going to actually use a little thing called a space ball to help fill in that gap. But we do want a little bit of wiggle room to help us during assembly. And that way, if we got to move it up or down a little bit, we'll have some room to play. So I'll leave about a 3/8 inch to 3/16 of an inch gap at the top of each one of the slats. After marking them, I'll just head over to the bandsaw and trim them off. Now, as mentioned earlier, when we were machining the slats, I made my center one a little extra wide. Now, there's a good chance you can have a lot of incremental error by using a space block method like this. So I made my panels, excuse me, a little too wide, and now what I'll do is fit it between these two spacer blocks and re-rip it to the appropriate width. And now with a good fit, I'll go ahead and trim off the top to its overall length. I very carefully laid out a center line mark at the top of my center slat. Now what I want to do is line that center line mark up with the center line mark on my upper rail. Then I can go ahead and put in my spacer blocks the same way I did on the lower rail, except for now I'll work from the center going out. When you put in your spacers along that curved rail, you don't want to have them twisted around so that they're flush at the top. That really means nothing, and it'll be concealed later on. You want the ends of the spacers to be perfectly parallel and flush with the sides of the slats. And working from the center out, we'll just bring all the tension in and then tack each one of the spacer blocks in place. With all the spacer blocks in place now, what we want to do is number each of the slats so we can get them back in the same location. So I'm just going to start at one end, slide the slat out, and number the sockets. And then at the very end of each of the slats, I'll also put a number there in the corresponding slot. And now we can go about laminating together the other 3/4 inch piece that covers up our spacer blocks. And I'll laminate that in basically the same process I did with the other members of the bed frame. Now I do want to use glue very gingerly around each of these spacers because I don't want squeeze out in there. Otherwise I'll just have to clean it out later on. And when you do laminating, you'll know that the boards want to slide around on each other. So with that extra 2-inch space on the end, I can drive in a brad to help hold everything in alignment. Well, that should about do it. Plenty of clamps, good and tight, some cauls to spread out that clamping pressure. I'll repeat the same on the next 3 rails. The straight rails can be cleaned up pretty easily by following conventional procedures. We'll first pass the board over on one edge across the jointer to clean up that edge. Then we'll rip off the other edge so that the board's to the appropriate width. And finally, we can go over to the compound miter saw and cut it off to its proper length. The curved rails require belt sanding or some form of shaping. Now you could go through and make a template and route the edges using a router and a template with a template router bit, but with only 2 of the curved rails, it's pretty easy to do with the belt sander. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of patience. To help with cutting off the ends of our curved rails, I'm using a scrap piece of wood. It's nothing more than a piece of 1/4-inch plywood, and I've put a couple pieces of double-faced tape on there. And what I want to do is take the rail, now at this point that plywood's tight up against my fence, and I'll take my rail, hold it tight against the fence, and bring it down on that plywood. Now the purpose of that plywood is to give us a large bearing surface to hold everything square and perpendicular to the blade while we do our cutoff operations. Now we can go ahead and round over the edges using a 1/4-inch radius roundover bit in the handheld router. Cutting the mortises in the ends of the rails uses the same jig, we just tilt everything over on its side. Other than that, the procedure is the same. I'm getting ready now to finish making the tenon stock. Now I'm using 3/8 inch thick cherry, and this is left over from the material that I made the slats from. Now we do need to round over the edges so that it fits our mortise properly. And to do that, I've installed a roundover bit here in my router, and I'll be using this in my router table. Now it's a little bit easier to work with a larger piece, so I'm going to round over the edges first, and then we'll cut off the tenons to their proper length. Sometimes you just want to add a nice unique element to a project to give it a little bit more character. And to do it in this case, we're using a 3-dimensional applique. And it's a little walnut diamond shaped piece that we attach to the center slat on the headboard. And we'll show you how we do that. To make the diamond applique, I'm starting out with a piece of walnut that's a 1/4-inch thick, and I ripped it to a width of 3 1/4 and cut it off to a length of 5 1/4. Then I went through and drew out the lines that we'll end up cutting here at the bandsaw to make the diamond shape. And now for a little touch-up work here on the disc sander. The next step for our applique is to bevel the faces. And to do that, I'm modifying my tenoning jig that we built in our last issue. And all I really had to do on it was to tack on a couple of pieces of 3/8 inch thick material. Then I tilted my saw blade over at about 11 degrees and adjusted my fence so that this face near the bottom edge is about 1/16 of an inch away from the blade. Then I took one cut through, and that created this nice little ledge to support our diamond applique. Without that, there's a good chance that the saw blade will pull the applique down into the blade, because it's very difficult to get a zero clearance insert when your blade is tilted over at an angle like this. So now all we need to do, clamp this piece on very securely, and then we can go ahead and take those cuts. Now we're ready to fasten the applique onto our center slat for the headboard. Now I've carefully laid out the location as to where the top edge of this slat fits up into that upper rail, and I made a very small pencil mark to show me that. Then I centered up the applique left to right, and then I measured this distance from the edge of the board to the points on the diamond, and then came down that same distance from the top. Then I made 4 very small pencil marks at each point on the applique. Now it's just a matter of applying a little bit of glue, and we'll probably have to tape this in place. To minimize any chance of glue squeeze out, use as minimal amount of glue. Now when we set this on there, we want to make sure we get it in the exact position where we want it to be. We don't want to have to slide it around. Now with it in position, I'll take some tape it in place. That's right, we're going to be finishing the bed before assembly. Now I like to use wipe-on oil products on cherry. It just brings out the natural beauty of the wood. However, in this case, with this type of a project, it's very difficult to wipe on that finish between each of these slats and so forth. So we're going to try something a little different, and that's to finish the bed before assembly. I have taken some precautions and masked off each of the mortise joints, or the mortises, so that the finish can't get in there to contaminate that glue joint. Now the finish we've come up with is a little bit of work, but I think it's going to give us some great results. This is raw cherry. This is cherry with tung oil on it, and that's one of the favored of many woodworkers, just tung oil on cherry. This is the same cherry, of course, but we've put on a coat of the tung oil sealer and stain, which has a pigment in it called red mahogany. Too dark for what we want. So we thinned it out with about 20% of the stain product with just clear tung oil, and it came out pretty close, but it's a little bit too blotchy. So we tried a 2-step process. First applied tung oil, let that dry, and then applied our thinned down stain, and that gave me the look I want. So there will be 3 steps. We'll wipe on a coat of clear tung oil, then wipe on a coat of the tung oil with the stain mixture, 20% of the pigmented with 80% of the clear tung oil. And then our third and final step would be an oil and urethane top coat, again a wipe-on product. Application is very easy, and we'll jump right in. To apply the clear tung oil, I'm just using a heavy-duty shop towel, and I'll flow it onto the project. Rubbing it in, making sure I get all the little nooks and crannies. And you do want to apply this fairly wet. Get a good even coat of it. Then we'll let it soak in for about 10 minutes or so, and then wipe off the excess with a dry cloth. Just a good buffing with a dry cloth to remove any of the excess. And we'll set this aside to dry for about an hour or 2, and then we can move on to the next step. The second coat of tung oil with the stain mixed in it goes on the same way. We wipe it on good and wet, working with the grain. Let it soak in for a couple minutes, and then wipe off the excess with a dry rag. And you'll notice that all it really does is just tone the wood a little bit, give it a little more even color, make it just a teeny bit more reddish brown. For a top coat, I'm going to wipe on a couple of coats of an oil and urethane product. Now to apply it, it's a little bit different than the tung oil that we did before. You're going to apply it with a lint-free cotton cloth, and I usually use an old t-shirt that I cut up into a small applicator pad, and then you'll wipe it on, and then with that same wet rag, you'll even out the coat as you apply it. Now I will apply 2 coats of this, sanding lightly between coats with 600 grit sandpaper. And the whole purpose of that is just to remove the dust nibs that you may get in your finish. With the finishing all done, we can turn our attention to assembly. Pretty straightforward, not a lot to it. Take a look. Now that the finish has had a chance to dry thoroughly, we can move on to final assembly. I've already gone through, dry fit everything, so I know I'm in good shape. Now the slats float in their mortises. However, we're going to use these little space balls that will help take up some of the space or gap in there, and that will help hold the slats from rattling. And they're just small little rubber balls, and you place them up in the mortise. Other than that, we'll apply some glue to each of the mortises for the legs as well as the rails, but again, not the slats, and then we can clamp everything together to dry. Now just slide each of the slats in its mortise and bring the top rail into position and start balancing them out. And we'll just throw a couple of bar clamps on there, set it aside to dry. The headboard assembles the same way. The mattress is supported by these heavy-duty angle brackets, and you can pick these up at your woodworking store. Now to fasten them, I'm using 3 number 12 by 1 inch long wood screws. I start out by pre-drilling the hole for the screws with a 7/64 inch drill bit, being careful not to drill through. Then we just drive the screws in. The angled portion of the side rail fastener gets mounted to the leg using number 8 by 1 inch long wood screws. Now we do have to be careful that we position this relative to the center of this rail so that it's easy to figure out where the position is on the center of the side rail for the mounting plate. The next thing that we have to make sure of is that we've got enough width between the rails to accommodate the mattress. Now in this case, this mattress, a full size, is 54 inches wide. So I'm allowing 54 1/4 inches of space between the two side rails, and that should be more than adequate for the mattress. Now all we have to do, drill the holes and finish mounting up the hardware. For the number 8 screws, you pre-drill with a 5/64 inch drill bit. Now make sure that when you mount your plates on, that the side rail fits into the keyhole slots near the top and then slides down. The side rail needs to come down to lock in, so don't mount these upside down. For the plate that goes on the side rail, center that up, do your layout for that. Then position it in place, and I'm just using my square here to help hold everything flush along the end. Transfer my hole locations, and we'll drill it up and mount it up just as we did with the other piece. Well, as you can see, this is the completed bed. It was a lot of fun to build and construct. It presented enough challenges to keep it very interesting. Now I hope you have as much fun building your bed as I did building this one. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home. Thanks for watching.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.